Welcome to Heart of Gold, brought to you by bcgold.com. The history of BC is the history of gold. Prospectors and adventurers alike from around the world moved to this part of the country specifically because of the mineralization in this province and still are today. Brought to you by bcgold.com. Welcome everyone to Heart of Gold. I'm your host, Drew Clarke. You're tuned to Gulf Island Radio. Heart of Gold is produced by David L. Gordon and is sponsored by bcgold.com. Thank you for joining us. This first show will be an overview of some of the things we hope to cover as we progress through the various episodes. And we do hope that you will stay tuned and listen to all of them and give us your feedback on them, if you will. The Pacific Ocean was largely the domain of the Portuguese and the Spanish for a very long time. It wasn't until people like Captain Cook and Captain Vancouver got a hold of Spanish charts that they attempted to come around the bottom of South America and enter the Pacific Ocean on voyages of discovery, largely to find the fabled Northwest Passage. There were many expeditions by the British, but more importantly, to begin with, let's look at the Spanish, shall we? The Spanish beat Cook and Vancouver here by probably 10, if not closer to 15 or 20 years. And this is evidenced by the fact that there are workings on southern Vancouver Island of Spanish origin. I'm talking mining activity. And the Spanish, after all, really had no interest in populating the world. They only wanted the gold and the silver that other folks had. And so as we watch them go around the world, their history is pretty much one of conquering and plundering and then leaving. Well, they had been here. It was rumored they had been here, but we didn't find the fabled passage known as Juan de Fuca Strait for some time, although there was good reason to believe that it did exist, and there were longitudes and latitudes taken of where it was supposed to be. When the English ships got here, based probably on the time of year they left England and the time it took to get here, it seems the straits were always shrouded by fog. The southern tip of Vancouver Island, the north end of the United States, and it is known for a thick fog bank that you would not go near in a large sailing ship with no motor. The tides would take you mercilessly towards shore, and in fog there's never any wind. Of course, these were all very big sailing ships, some of them smaller ones, but nonetheless hundreds wrecked on the coastlines of northern Washington and Vancouver Island as they attempted to find the Straits of Juan de Fuca and the safety therein. In the early days, before America had gotten very big, before California was a territory, and much before it was a state, Alaska had not been sold to the Americans and was owned by Russia, and was a good fishing grounds mainly for Russia, but too far away from the motherland to be settled. They decided to pick up some land down in California, the Russians, and they bought a piece of land that they planned, I believe, on allowing to be winter quarters for their people who would be up in the Alaskan area every summer. So that probably would have happened had not the Americans bought Alaska for some $7 million. After this had occurred, the Russian-American Fur Company divested itself of the property they had bought in what was to become California for some $60,000, $65,000, I believe, at the time. And coincidentally, they sold it to a man named Sutter. Sutter is a name we all remember, for it was to be on Mr. Sutter's property that gold was first discovered, which led to the 1848-1849 stampede to what was just about to become a territory known as California. 3 days before California was declared a territory, an American by the name of Sam Brannan wheeled into San Francisco with a large jar of nuggets of gold taken from the Sutter property up in the Sierra Nevadas outside of Sacramento. No one had any idea at that point that there was gold to be had in that area, and you can imagine Mr. Brannan created quite a stir when he stood out in the middle of the street in San Francisco, which at that time had a population of 800 people, and announced that gold had been found at Sutter's Mill. A huge uproar ensued, and people headed for Sacramento and Sutter's Mill and surrounding areas by the droves. Within a couple of days, San Francisco was virtually a ghost town. Now, Sam Brannan was a merchant. He also was a newspaper owner. And Mr. Brannan proceeded to print up 200 copies of the discovery story and load them on mules and sent them east to St. Louis. It took 4 months for the pack train to reach St. Louis with news of the California discovery. And sometime shortly thereafter, President James Polk received 230 some odd ounces of nuggets and dust from the strike area as evidence of its veracity. And President Polk issued a statement authenticating the discovery, which then caused a stampede across America to California. This was to be known as the Great Rush of 1849. The prospectors and merchants and shoe salesmen and ladies of the day and evening all headed for California and took on the moniker 49ers, the originals heading out for the big strike. And they did very well. There are stories of pounds of gold coming out of the ground. It's just not even fathomable, but I'm going to give you a little estimate here of what the heck it was. Where is it now? Well, one fella dug up 8 pounds of gold in a very short period of time. And I don't see where I had it written down, but I'll find it. I know where it is. It's coming up here. They were picking it up basically on the surface, which is very rare, and that is what's called placer gold. Placer gold is loose, that has come down from another source, usually by means of erosion and water, carrying it along. And placer gold is what we've had in British Columbia to a great extent that started our gold rushes as well. And we'll get to that in later episodes. So Sam Brannan caused San Francisco to tip right on its head with news of this discovery at Sutter's Mill. I imagine the Russians must have found out about it. Okay, the first summer there were about 5,000 people working the California strike. One person pulled out 62 pounds of nuggets in 8 days, working with hand tools. Another one, 17 ounces in 2 hours. And this was basically within a few inches of the surface in the creeks surrounding Sutter's property and in the hills of the Sierra Nevadas. And we will get to all of that on later shows and tell you more about how that happens geologically with my co-host, Dave Anthony from bcgold.com, who sponsors this show. But for now, this is just an overview, and we will get to that in our next show as we slowly work our way up the coast to Victoria and across the strait to the Fraser River and beyond to the gold fields of the Klondike and the Caribou. We'll be finding out what it takes to be a prospector back then and what it takes now, what's required, what kind of equipment you should get, whether you want to get carried away and actually become more than just a recreational rockhound and prospector, perhaps get a free miner's license and some more expensive gear. It's a great way to spend your day, good way to spend the weekend, great for educating the kids. Fresh air is nice. The view sometimes can be quite incredible. And it's fun to get lucky once in a while. And virtually every time I go out prospecting, I find something that I like. It doesn't have to be gold. It doesn't have to be silver or gemstones. I always seem to find something that makes me go, golly, will you look at that? And so if you like those kinds of things, you've been watching the TV shows, we'll be talking about how much of that is real, what kind of an investment they have, and what the return ratio is. It probably pays to stay small is where that's going. And as I say, it's good family fun. Does it or can it cover expenses? Another question we'll be asking, as well as where you can and cannot prospect without having a claim and what the camping regulations are, etc. So, that's the basic idea for Heart of Gold. And as we get up to the BC coast, little did Captain Vancouver know, when he created his first Admiralty chart for the British Navy, which was one of the things he was tasked to do, was completely chart the inside passage here up to the top end of Vancouver Island and beyond. And I can tell you that he did a fine job. If you take a look online at Captain Vancouver's first Admiralty chart of the West Coast here, and believe me, they didn't even know for sure Vancouver Island was an island until they could prove that the Wanapeuca Strait existed. And there are many maps of the coast here showing Vancouver Island as part of the mainland, with no Georgia Strait, Salish Sea, or Campbell River and Johnson Straits above it or anything like that. But there's this beautiful chart done by the cartographer aboard Captain Vancouver's ship, and a magnificent piece of work it is. Absolutely perfect. But you know, the reason I was looking at that chart was I wanted to see the bottom of Vancouver Island. I wanted to see the mountain tops. I had an idea that over the years since the discoveries and in the passing eons, there might have been a bit of a replenishment of some of these creeks. We'll be talking about Leechtown, the Leech River, etc., the Souk area, Jordan River, and Port Renfrew in further shows. And they're all heavily mineralized. All the creeks flowing into Wanapeuca are gold-bearing. And this is where I started, and with my friends, started to look into having some fun over in southern Vancouver Island and doing a little prospecting. In my quest, I was seeking a road map, one that showed the logging roads that are now out in the foothills of southern Vancouver Island, which never existed before. And after all these years, logging, although, that's contentious, and I agree, has produced a lot more access and easier to get to the back country in a short period of time and go have a look at what's going on. So this is where we started, and I was hoping to find myself a chart that would show all the new roads that have been put in by the big companies off-road from Souk and Port Renfrew and down south of Lake Cowichan. Well, sure enough, there was the Admiralty chart. Of course, this wasn't up to date, and it really wasn't of much use to me, but I had a look at it anyways. It was proffered to me by my friend and partner, Rory, and I was admiring it, but looking at the southern part of it, I was astounded that the bottom end of Vancouver Island seemed incomplete. Very much so, in fact. Hardly a darn mark to show for any geological features south of Cowichan. And that just didn't figure to me, although there were these strange marks on the chart. Well, those strange marks were not so strange, and they weren't put there by Captain Vancouver's cartographer, was the first thing I realized. In fact, these were leftovers from the Spanish chart that was attained by the British and led them here up the Pacific coast to our territory. Darn if they hadn't made some marks on this chart. And those marks were a way of triangulating a location on southern Vancouver Island, which I immediately recognized as where they were prospecting. And that led me to a certain hill outside the Souk area known as Valentine Mountain. And that's one of the reasons the show is called Heart of Gold. The other reason is my mom's born on Valentine's Day, and so I thought this was all pretty good stuff. I went home that night, looked at a real chart, and realized what hill the Spanish had marked with this triangulation feature, and it was very subtle. You wouldn't have noticed. Captain Vancouver never noticed. I doubt if anybody until I did notice. But here it was. And so it plainly in the books was Valentine Mountain, where there had been a great discovery in the 1970s and early 80s, and is still held today by a company known as Great Thunder Gold. And they have some 17,000 to 18,000 acres under claim in the area of Valentine Mountain, Bear Lake Reservoir, Jordan River Meadows, etc. And so I picked up a couple of claims up there. And every once in a while I get a chance to run in there and poke around. And it's lots of fun. I get to chase the bears around, and they get to chase me. And I'm learning a lot about geology. That place in particular has suffered an awful lot of volcanic activity and plate shifting, tectonics. And it's an education. And I'm just old enough to appreciate it now. So I recommend it if you enjoy getting out and getting your hands in the dirt, going for a good hike, and like finding nifty stuff. Maybe amateur prospecting and rock hounding is something you might like to try. It just takes throwing the cooler in the car and packing a few things, and away you go. Maybe a bit of pepper spray. So, Vancouver Island was granted a charter, or rather Hudson's Bay Company was granted a charter of Vancouver Island by the British Crown, with the mind of settlement, and the Crown thought that Hudson's Bay Company was going to go ahead and take care of this. They would bring settlers in, and Vancouver Island would become active and prosperous, which was a great idea, but this isn't quite what Hudson's Bay Company had in mind. In fact, until the charter was revoked, Hudson's Bay Company pretty much grabbed all the land that was any good for themselves and their employees and wouldn't let too many folks in. So for a while, Vancouver Island was not going full speed, let's say. And Fort Victoria in the 1830s to the 1860s was gradually picking up speed. But there weren't a lot of folks there, you know. Originally, we had the SS Beaver and the Otter running around for the Navy, taking care of things. But Victoria had a population of about 225, and once things started to happen, geologic discoveries were made, which was shortly to follow with the Vancouver Island expedition launched by the governor, and Vancouver Island went from 225 to 5,000 within a month. So Fort Victoria gets going, and Governor Douglas decides that they've got to do more exploration on Vancouver Island for mineral wealth and timber survey, etc. So he sends off a group of a couple of dozen guys in different directions to discover anything and everything and map and report back. One of the parties was led by Captain Peter Leach. And Captain Leach was actually somewhere else when the discoveries were made, but got credit for it. Leach Town was a gold camp. It was up the Leach River from Souk, heading towards Souk Lake. It was very close to Victoria, and very quickly a trail was hacked through the bush that made it even easier to get to Leach Town. And the Leach River and the West Leach River and areas around were all of a sudden a big deal. And people started heading up. This was after the California rush had petered out. The California thing lasted a couple of years, where pretty much anybody and everybody from all over the world came and dug and profited, to a situation where, after becoming a territory, American citizens decided that others from around the world of other nationalities, including the Mexicans and the natives, had no right to be in their country and taking their mineral wealth. So there was a lot of pushback from the new Americans, and many prospectors who had come from South America, Europe, etc., the east coast of Canada, other places, were basically frozen out of the good ground, and most gave up and went away, or started other businesses in the state, such as going down to San Francisco, for example, and becoming a merchant. And Sam Brannan, after his announcement in San Francisco, did very well for himself as a merchant, and no doubt his newspapers, which arrived in St. Louis 4 months after he had sent them out on pack mule, must have arrived a little rumpled and soggy, but they got there, and America was never the same. There had never before been a time or a place where citizens could claim what they found. Similar to the old days where you couldn't hunt the king's deer and everything belonged to the ruler and had to be turned over to the crown or the state. There was none of that in the new United States. It was anyone's for the digging, and if you could hold on to it, it was yours. So this was very new and very exciting for people. They had never had an opportunity before to turn their luck around and become wealthy, and many, many did. Today in British Columbia, people are still working the ground. BC has always been a busy area for prospecting. It started out in Leach Town outside of Victoria there, but very quickly spread across to the Fraser River, very quickly spread from there up to the Klondike and up to the Caribou, back to the eastern part of the province, down through Grand Forks and Rock Creek, Greenwood, Slocan, Silverton, etc. The whole province seems to have an area for this and an area for that. There's gemstones and jade and oil and gas and minerals of all kinds. It really is quite an exciting place. And the crazy thing is that we're still a very young province, it's still a very young country. People are still coming here from all around the world. We welcome them with open arms and help them out, usually to get them started, and before long, everybody seems to be pretty happy about getting their chance to become a Canadian citizen. So as we go along with Heart of Gold, we hope to entertain you with true stories about real people who have paid their dues and are in the history books as a result, the various places they have worked and prospected throughout British Columbia and the Yukon, and those who are still doing it today. So join us as we carry on with each episode of Heart of Gold here at Gulf Island Radio. And Heart of Gold is brought to you by bcgold.com. bcgold.com have information and claims for sale throughout British Columbia and some in the Yukon. Largely placer claims. There are placer claims and there are hard rock claims. Hard rock, of course, where you scrape all the gravel and everything off the ground, and there it is, a big lump of rock under your feet, and you've got to drill through that and blast and put tunnels in, etc. And your ore comes out of solid rock. Placer is stuff that perhaps was once in solid rock, but has been broken free by erosion, etc., and brought down to the river mouths and along the streams by water and erosion and snow and ice, etc., breaking loose chunks from the sides of the canyons. And we have quite a history here. Originally, when Vancouver Island, for example, was formed, the southern part wasn't all complete until another couple of chunks came crashing into it and left Vancouver Island as it is today. Several pieces of different structures of island from where we perhaps know not. But we know that originally it was much smaller and that other pieces from different areas wound up getting stuck to it. It's all very interesting stuff. I have my guest and sponsor, Dave Anthony from bcgold.com, going to join us in the next show, and he will explain a lot of the geological factors that go into how this is all created, how you can recognize certain things, where you need to be careful about where you are, etc., regulations, and as I say, the various aspects of searching and working your claim. So please join us as we carry on with Heart of Gold next week with my co-host and sponsor from bcgold.com, Dave Anthony. I'm your host of Heart of Gold, Drew Clarke. Thanks to Dave Gordon, producer at Gulf Island Radio, beaming to you free from the heart of the Salish Sea. This is me saying so long. We'll see you next week. The history of BC is the history of gold. Prospectors and adventurers alike from around the world moved to this part of the country specifically because of the mineralization in this province and still are today. Tune in next week for another exciting episode of Heart of Gold on Gulf Island Radio, brought to you by bcgold.com.